Thanks so much for joining us. As always, I'm Dr. Sean Hashmi. Don't forget to check out selfprinciple.org. Let's take a look at the PURE trial and ask the question whether or not saturated fat is now considered to be healthy for us. So with that, let's get started. In 2017, the PURE trial came out, and what's unique about this study was, one, it's a prospective study, which means it's looking forward, and number two, it was a large study looking at 18 countries from 5 continents. And basically, they wanted to explore the issue of macronutrients, your proteins, your carbohydrates, your fats, and to see what is their relationship to mortality and have we gotten it all wrong. And especially because some of the previous studies have looked at things like North American or European, the question is, well, what about the rest of the world? Especially if you look at, for example, in California, where we have sort of a melting pot. Does that data really hold true? So what's unique about the PURE trial was that, number one, it was a very large study, 7.4 years, 18-country study. They were looking at over 135,000 individuals, and they were recording what they ate using a validated food frequency questionnaire. So in terms of those 18 countries, there were high income, medium income, and low income. And it's important to understand what these countries are, because that helps you to understand what kind of people we are looking at in this particular data. So what did they want to find? Well, their primary outcomes were they wanted to see what is the risk of death and the events of cardiovascular in nature, so heart attacks, etc. And their second outcomes were all other things, so all other heart attacks, stroke, any kind of death from cardiovascular disease, and any kind of death from non-cardiovascular disease. And once again, good, strong follow-up at 7.4 years. So what were the adjustments? Adjustments are always important because you want to know what were the things that they were trying to exclude for. Otherwise, it can create issues as far as the validity of or reliability of the data. So age, sex, education, waist to hip ratio, smoking, physical activity, diabetes, where they were located, and things like how much energy they took in. Okay, so let's get into the results. What did they find? Well, if you were consuming the highest amount of fat versus if you were somebody who was consuming the lowest amount of fat, those who consumed the highest amount of fat had a 33% reduction in the risk of death from all causes. And from non-cardiovascular disease-related causes, there was still a 30% reduction. How about saturated fat, right? So if you ate a lot of saturated fat, well, highest versus lowest, you had a reduction in mortality by 14%. And a stroke reduction by 21%. What about carbohydrates? Okay, same thing. If you ate a lot of carbohydrates, you had a higher mortality by 28%. And if you looked at non-cardiovascular mortality, it was higher by 36%. And then they showed what if you took those people who were eating carbohydrates and you replaced it with things like monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, protein, or even saturated fatty acids. Was there any kind of improvement? Well, saturated fatty acids looked like there was an improvement, but unlike all the other studies we have where there is a benefit from polyunsaturated fatty acids and monos, there wasn't a benefit in this particular study. Kind of interesting and kind of raises a lot of questions. Okay, so let's kind of come to the conclusion everybody wants to know about. Is saturated fat back? And if so, what is the recommendation? And are carbohydrates really enemy number one? So here's what the issues are. First, when they looked at the PURE trial, they did a very good job of breaking down fat into things like polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, and saturated. But there's no explanation of carbohydrates. So specifically, what are whole grains versus refined? And if you're wondering why this matters, it's because refined grains, so that's all your white breads, white pastas, white rice, all that stuff, is associated with higher heart disease risk than things like whole grains, whether it's whole wheat pasta, it's whole wheat bread, etc. Also, we know that the people who consume the largest amount of carbohydrates are actually in lower income countries. And guess what? Those countries, the poorer countries, they're mostly consuming refined carbohydrates, which we already know raise the risk for heart disease. And then the flip side is, when they looked at the data, the largest consumption of fat was in higher income countries where they actually have higher availability to clean water, better resources, healthcare, etc. So the question that came up on my mind was, does the PURE trial really show that a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, it really is a proxy for basically being poor? And if you are poor, you can actually look at the study and say poverty is a risk factor for death. And of course, any study that uses food frequency questionnaire, there's going to be recall bias, right? You have to understand that. And if you did what in this study was happening, which was a single measurement of what people ate at the baseline, of course, people change. And the longer follow-up you have, especially in this case over 7 years, people's dietary habits can change. And with every population-based study, of course, there's no such thing as causation. These are all correlation. But here's where it's really, really important to understand. The highest levels of total fat intake that we were looking at were actually comparable to what's really recommended by Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, right, USDA, etc. So it turns out that the people in the PURE trial who were considered consuming high fat were actually really not consuming high fat, but lower fats. And those intakes were actually lower than what's found in the United States and Europe. And then the other part that's interesting about the study is the funding disclosures. You always have to look at it. So things like the Sugar Association and the big pharmas that are in there, the question is, for a nutrition study, why do you need pharma? And then the second paper on the PURE trial, which was published at the same time, showed that higher intakes of things like fruit, vegetables, legumes, consumptions were actually associated with what? Lower risk for heart disease and risk for death. So let's summarize and see what is the bottom line here. Well, basically, the study doesn't give us enough information to say we need to change our recommendation for increasing fat consumption. Their data shows that the current fat consumption is actually, in the high group, is actually in line with what's recommended currently. Less than 10% saturated fat and less than 30% overall. Well, that was what the highest group was actually consuming, around 30 and around 10. And number two is that higher intakes of things like refined grains, or in other words, poor quality carbohydrates, are bad for you. This isn't anything new. So for everyone out there who's consuming lots of whole foods, lots of fresh fruits and vegetables, they are sleeping 7 to 9 hours a night, they're moving, they're practicing mindfulness, gratitude, you are doing everything you can to have a state of optimal health. And you always want to look at studies in a critical view so that we make sure that we are not just jumping to the headlines that are appearing on all sorts of media. So I want to thank everybody for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.